even the civil rights of folks I strictly disagree with, because that's important to maintain our kind of democracy. Anyway, this organization, the ACLU, through the decades, through the 70s, through a series of court decisions that were well warranted, because they gathered some of the worst cases of people that had been hospitalized for no reason except their families had given up on them, and that's what was done. When you were hospitalized in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, they broke your dinner plate at home because they knew you were never coming back. In any case, ACLU said, you can't make those people work in your fields. That's exploitation. So all that stopped. So in our hospital, just like every other hospital, people have to earn passes. You can't go outside on your own unsupervised. You certainly can't have a job. Oh, my God. That's exploitation, slavery. But we do have what we call work therapy that's approved. It's inside work for the folks that can do it. So we've been able to squeak through some humane work that doesn't involve outside manual labors, which seems to be frowned on in those court decisions, which I think is a mistake. But anyway, we've got overcrowded wards. We have higher rates of violence. We have everything that the rat experiments of the 60s and 70s proved. If you overcrowd a maze with rats, guess what happens? They all don't sit together and sing cheerful songs from the 1930s and 40s. They start fighting. And that's what happens nowadays. And it's a real clinical, legal, institutional mistake. But off to other things. So we went through the era of deinstitutionalization. And everybody thought things were going well. We had well-motivated do-gooders who were really working in the right direction. And I use the term do-gooders not in a prejudicial or pejorative way. It was the next thing to come, and that is outpatient housing and outpatient-based care for the chronically mentally ill. And this is the population that we're talking about that poses such a problem in this country, which is really at least 1 to 1.5% of the population. So we're not talking about small numbers. If we're a country of 330 million or so, that means we've got 30 million people at least with chronic severe mental illness that will never go away, that requires lifetime treatment and supervision, and not the regular outpatient private psychiatry and psychology practices of, several months on an antidepressant, several months marital counseling, and things get resolved one way or the other, and you go your merry way. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people with real brain disease that we now know are closely related to the neurodegenerative brain diseases of Parkinsonism, dementias, and other things. There's much more commonality biogenetically and developmentally than we ever thought before 50 years ago. Everything was separated and classified in different categories, and that's eroding day by day in psychiatry and the mental health research that's going on today. So in 1963, the Comprehensive Mental Health Center Act under President Kennedy was enacted. And one of the first of these hospitals was located in South Carolina, Marshall I. Pickens Hospital. Hubert Humphrey was there for the inauguration and I guess bottle breaking or ribbon cutting or whatever it was they did. And there was to be a string of regional, smaller psychiatric hospitals all over this country, intended to largely replace the large institutional state hospitals and also to provide shorter-term inpatient psychiatric care that was needed everywhere. Marshall Pickens Hospital, for instance, is located right next door to Greenville Memorial Hospital and serves as its psychiatric unit. And this was needed all over the country. However, with the Vietnam War, guess what happened? Funding just dried up, and these were not built. There were several of them built around the country, but the network of dozens, if not several hundred of these, evaporated. So by the 70s, with the continued discharge, because of the efforts of the ACLU and other advocacy groups, the exodus of patients that were really moderately mentally ill, not the worst, but enough to walk down the street and buy something at a convenience store but do nothing else, continued. In New York City, for instance, they started housing them in renovated abandoned hotels. And they were called the welfare hotels because people also on welfare lived in those places because it was the only place they could afford. And, you know, they became like the projects, the sort of mental health Cabrini Green projects with gang infestation, gangs taking over, robbing people. It was just a horrendous mess. And it was all because we didn't provide the outpatient settings and housing and facilities and staff needed on a national or state regional basis needed for those folks. And that has not changed largely since the 1970s when that was sort of the solution in the big cities. In the not-so-big cities, situations were worse, and we started to see other things happen. By the 1990s, state hospitals had their beds cut even further, their capacities legislatively reduced because first we had the dot-com economy, and then we had the housing mortgage bubble, and then we had the Great Recession, no matter what anybody calls it, which I call now the slow recession that continues, because our recovery has been the slowest on record. My hospital, for instance, was reduced from 792 beds to 292 beds in one fell swoop just a little over a decade ago. So guess what happened? This happened at the other two state hospitals in our state. Capacities were reduced by about 2/3, and we had trans-institutionalization, and that's where we're at now. The mentally ill are flooding the jails, flooding the ERs. It is not uncommon anywhere, any state in the union, for a psychiatric patient, especially a child, to have to wait for up to a month for a psychiatric placement somewhere. The best but the worst illustration of this was Gus Deeds, 23-year-old young man, son of State Senator Craig Deeds, Ph.D., clinical psychologist in Virginia. And it's been right at between 2 and 3 years ago, when Gus had a psychotic break. He had a chronic mental illness, a severe one, a recurrent one, a major one, and everyone knew it. His dad was a clinical psychologist, and they had well cared for him. But he had an uncontrollable episode and had to be acutely hospitalized. He was held in a Virginia hospital emergency room for 4 days. And during those 4 days, he, of course, got quick emergency psychiatry treatment, starting medications again, quick neuroleptization, as we call it, quick administration of medicines, trying to tamp down symptoms. And I don't know the particulars of this part, but legally, by review, he apparently was judged as no longer dangerous imminently to himself or others and was released. Now, during this time, they were waiting and searching all over the state for an inpatient psychiatric bed for him. There were none. I won't editorially comment on why there may not have been none. I suspect it was other factors than all the hospitals in Virginia were full that those 4 days, something I find hard to believe, especially in the private sector, but that's another story for another day. And I spent 20 years in the private sector, so I know what I'm talking about in a not good sense. But in any case, Gus was, unfortunately, in retrospect, judged legally by mandated legal review because he was involuntarily committed by the legal arm of every state's review of involuntary admissions to be eligible for discharge. He was discharged, and within a few days, he tried to stab his father to death, and then, shortly thereafter, he successfully committed suicide. Now, I have said in the past, I cannot imagine what his father, Senator Deeds, went through. However, I hail him as, quite frankly, one of the national heroes still to this day of national mental health reform. He quickly got himself together. I don't know how he did it. And started pushing the Virginia legislature to reform their state system and to start looking at what they needed to do. And the first thing they did was establish a statewide database of all beds, private and public. So if a patient was in the ER, it didn't matter. Private patients, if they had a bed, had to take them, even if they didn't want to. And things improved somewhat, but they still needed a lot more. And they're making great progress in the state of Virginia. They have a study commission. Things are moving along. And they are moving especially in the outpatient reform sector. Now that's where we are now in most states. We are in between. Many states are facing the dilemma of whether or not to close hospitals that are literally falling down. The best example is Central State Hospital in Georgia in Milledgeville that has gobs of buildings that are just in utter disrepair. And it is being turned into a much smaller facility, as it used to be the biggest state hospital, psychiatric hospital in the world, housing up to 12,000 patients. But the salvageable and still habitable buildings are being turned into essentially a forensic psychiatric hospital treatment center and evaluation center for the state of Georgia, which is sorely needed. But the rest of the place is probably going to be torn to the ground in the years to come.